Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and I'm joined today by Tony Palmer, who's Senior Engineer and Analyst at Enterprise Strategy Group Lab. How you doing today, Tony?
Good morning, Mario. Pleasure to be here.
All right, joining us in studio to talk about the advanced capabilities and enterprise benefits of a SAN, but in the context of a small and medium business, which you may not think the two go together, but we'll have a good conversation about that. Our catchy title for today is Everybody Wants to Be Thin, but should really any SMBs care about thin provisioning and other of these touted features of storage area networks? What's really important from an SMB perspective? We'll go ahead and get into that. Today's session is about the needs of SMBs around shared storage. Naturally, a lot of small companies are running the same applications that enterprises do, and everybody wants always-on type service levels, but it's not necessarily feasible to invest in the same technologies that provide that from an enterprise perspective if you are an SMB shop. So we're looking to examine the features and benefits of shared storage in the context of small and medium business IT and talk about storage used not just for primary storage, but also data protection and test development uses. Tony, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because I've been working with ESG and ESG Lab for a number of years. Maybe the folks may not know exactly who ESG is.
Sure. Hi, my name is Tony Palmer. I'm the Senior Lab Engineer for Enterprise Strategy Group Lab. I'm based out here in San Francisco, and my area of coverage is the Silicon Valley. I spend most of my time hands-on testing storage, hardware, software solutions from vendors of really all over the storage industry, a little bit in security, a little bit in networking too, but with a focus on not just what it is and how it works, but what the value is to your business.
There's a lot of great research that's available for free out there, the Enterprise Strategy Group website, ESG. Why do SMBs need storage? And I think it's for the same reasons larger companies do. Tony, if you can help us understand storage as a holistic context, because a lot of people think it's just the disk that are attached to my server, but there's a lot to think about when you're thinking about storage, isn't there? There's
a ton to think about, right? I mean, storage is essentially, think of it more like a service, right? It's a service that you're providing to your applications. You're providing capacity for your email services. You're providing data availability in the case of failures or data loss, right? In the form of either backups or snapshots or just being able to recover quickly. That service, depending, and now talking about in the context of a small business has the same exact needs that a large company does, right? I mean, you want your email to be available all the time. You want your databases to be available all the time so that you can conduct your business. And in that context, you need that storage service to be online all the time.
Right. I think that you're probably seeing a lot of smaller companies also doing server virtualization to get the cost advantages of that technology.
Well, cost advantages, and also there's a lot of other benefits as well, right? You're talking about being able to keep applications online, being able to automatically and live rebalance resources, right? So server virtualization and storage virtualization really go hand in hand.
And that's one of the reasons why we want to talk about pooling storage. I think a lot of folks understand data protection. It's the backup stuff. You can use disk, you can use tape. There's a combination of things to do. But test and dev, talk a little bit about that, because any IT organization should have a test environment and their storage needs there as well.
Absolutely, and I can use ESG as an example, right? We're not a giant 1,000-person enterprise. We are about a 40-person company, largely distributed, people all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. And we have essentially a full test and dev environment that lives side by side alongside our production environment in our computer closet. Everything is hosted on just a couple of ESX servers. We've got some back-end storage, back-end iSCSI storage arrays. We do virtualization, snapshots, all of that stuff, basically to keep our systems online. And the test and dev environment is there so that we can test software updates and make sure that they don't break everything.
Yeah, my favorite word you just used was closet. You didn't say data center. You're a small medium business. The stuff doesn't need to fit in the closet, but you're doing data center type stuff with that infrastructure. In terms of a basic architecture, you talked about what you have. If a small and medium business is looking at putting together this architecture for virtualization or for shared storage, what are the basic components that they need?
Essentially, you need you'll need servers, you'll need shared storage devices, and that typically means a SAN, fiber channel or iSCSI, and a shared IP network, right? And that's That's pretty much the basic building blocks of the infrastructure that you're going to need.
And maybe you can give some comments just in your experience. We're talking about a SAN here. What would the advantages that this would have compared to doing direct attached storage? Because you could use internal hard drives on those servers. You could also direct attach some external enclosures to those. We're proposing a consolidated shared storage area network here. What are the advantages?
Well, there's a couple of advantages to using a shared storage model. And in the context of server virtualization, probably the most important one is enabling virtual server mobility. So if you have shared storage that is visible to all of the physical servers or the hypervisors that you've got in your environment, having a SAN allows you to move the virtual servers between physical servers, providing better availability, providing the ability to do testing, to do upgrades non-disruptively.
We'll talk a little bit more about some of the features that come with a SAN, because quite often in your experience doing this lab testing, Tony, the type of storage devices that go into a SAN typically come with features that help make sharing more reliable. It helps making operations more centralized and some of the management functions streamlined in order to be able to keep up with the pace of data growth.
Absolutely.
All right. Our next slide talks about the features in the context of SMB. And I know that hardware is something that people think about straight away, and there's some decisions to be made about what to buy if you're an SMB. So from a RAID perspective, Tony, in your experience, single disk versus dual disk redundancy, what does someone need to know about that?
Well, that's really the most basic availability component when you get right down to it. If everything is stored on a single hard drive, you're exposed. If that hard drive goes away, so do all your applications. Putting in some redundancy at least protects against that level of hardware failure. Having network access redundancy, basically being able to access that highly available group of disks from different paths on the network, provides another layer higher up the stack. But if you think about it, mirroring and RAID protection, well, that was the very first implementation of storage virtualization, right? What you've got are multiple disks strung together that are presenting a single or group of volumes to servers, and what it does is it allows you to survive disk failures.
Right. I think a lot of times when people are looking at hardware from an SMB perspective, they'd rather not deal with it at all. So they understand that you need redundancy, you need network access redundancy from a hardware perspective. People are looking at cloud storage. In your experience so far, you've done some testing of that. Where do you think it fits from an SMB perspective?
Well, the interesting thing is that it can fit in a lot of places. But the place where I've seen it most commonly now is in the field of, in the area of Tier 2 and backup, right? Where you can go to, say, an Amazon S3 or an AT&T Synoptic, and you can buy some capacity of cloud storage and attach to it and use it as a target. Use it as a place to store copies of your stuff so that you don't, you're not basically, making tape backups and sending the tapes off-site. You've got something online that you can connect to and pull your data back when you need it.
What is your experience so far from a testing perspective? You mentioned backup Tier 2 is a good use case. Is the throughput a concern that keeps it from being the primary storage? You couldn't really run your app off of the cloud in some cases. People will have local storage because of the SLA?
It depends on the app, and it depends on the requirement, right? But yeah, that's most people's concern as far as why not use the cloud for Tier 1. But what lots of vendors are starting to do is to use their devices as more or less a cache, right? So you've got your primary storage on this appliance, which then connects on the back end to the cloud, and that expands the capacity of the appliance without necessarily impacting your front end access.
Well, thanks for sharing that. We wanted to talk about cloud because it's the most commonly asked questions. People would prefer to not deal with some of the hardware if they can avoid it, but we'll talk for the rest of the program here about how to make the right choices for that local storage, because your applications are going to need that local storage, whether you use it only for primary or whether you use it for your local test dev or even local backups. From a software capability standpoint, looking at some of the things that storage does for you, you talked about the most basic redundancy, and people may not be familiar with the concept of how they deal with hot spares or how they rebuild their storage volumes in the case of a failure. Maybe you could talk about your experience and what SMBs need to understand there when they go to buy storage in the first place, how to get it bought correctly.
Sure. So lots and lots of the choices out there still use exactly the same methodology that they did 15 years ago, right? Essentially, you build a RAID group, you present a volume from that RAID group out. You might have the ability to select to create and select a hot spare in that, but you have to manage all that, and you have to think about all that yourself. The whole idea and the whole concept of it is that if a drive fails, I want my data to be available, and I want the system to take care of keeping my data available, and all I want it to do is to tell me this drive failed, you need to replace it.
Right.
That's all I care about. That's all I really want to worry about. So in the same context, these other bullets kind of come into play, right? Being able to expand storage simply by replacing a drive with a larger drive. Being able to utilize something like thin provisioning. And thin provisioning is very interesting because while it doesn't necessarily protect you against those unplanned outages, it protects you against planned outages, which are really common. If you have to expand storage to your email or your database servers, typically you've got to bring them down. You've got to shut them down. You've got to expand the storage or move everything to a larger volume and then bring it back up. Well, what if I could just yank out some 1 terabyte drives and put in 2 terabyte drives and now have more storage available to me without ever bringing my Exchange server down?
I think that's one of the best benefits of a SAN, because you can get this type of capability for all of your servers. Your pool can grow, and no matter how your applications change over time, you have a lot more flexibility to respond to the growth and demands in any of those applications. Let's take a closer look at thin provisioning. Give us kind of a 101 breakdown of what it means from an SMB perspective.
Absolutely. So this slide represents testing that ESG Lab has done against more than a dozen different solutions. And essentially, thin provisioning is exactly what you see on the slide here. Your server, whether it's a Windows server, or Linux server, an app server, whatever it is, sees a volume of a certain size. Okay? Traditionally, you had to have that much capacity provisioned and set aside as a LUN that was visible to that server. With thin provisioning, you have a pool of storage that can start out much smaller and then grow as the server needs more capacity, essentially. In the context of a small business, that's very important because essentially you really don't know whether you might have a good idea of where you think your apps and your email and your databases are going to grow too, but you don't necessarily know that for sure. In fact, it's very hard to predict. So what ends up happening is that administrators go out and they over-provision everything, and they say, I think that each of these systems are going to grow to about 300 gig. I only need 100 gig for each of them now. And then what happens is one will grow beyond that requirement, and another one will stay closer to the bottom of that. Now you've got this stranded storage that's assigned to a server that's not using it, and you can't move it to the other server that needs it. And that's the benefit that thin provisioning provides. It allows you to take a single pool of storage, assign it to all the servers that need it equally, and then let them use it as required, right? It's a cost benefit and an operational benefit.
Right. One of the reasons we're happy to have you on the program today, Tony, is that you've had hands-on experience with just about any SAN storage device that exists on the planet today. A lot of vendors have differing best practices recommendations about what size you should make your volume that you should present to your server, present to your application. So with thin provisioning, the concept is to present it a very large volume and have the back end grow over time. How do you balance that between recommendations that says you should use 80 gig LUNs as an example, and that might be an artifact of older architectures, versus larger volumes here? From an SMB perspective, do they get any benefit from creating a lot of smaller volumes and managing that, or are they safe if they just put a 2 terabyte volume and then have it grow over time?
There's really not a lot of benefit to do it in the old way, and the reason is that, well, let's think about it from the context of performance. Your performance is basically in a small block transactional application like email or database. Your performance is a direct proportion to the number of physical drives that you have in your environment. And the more physical drives that you can stripe your volume across, the better you're going to feel, right? So creating a bunch of small 80 gig LUNs or one big 2 terabyte LUN doesn't make a big difference. What really depends is how many disks are behind all that. And if I can do the same with a 2 terabyte LUN, just that single volume that's being presented to that server, and then increase the number of disks that are behind that, or put faster disks or bigger disks behind it as needed, well, then that solves all my problems, and I never have to take my server down to do it.
Right, and I think that's one of the reasons behind Drobo's best practices recommendation of creating 1 or 2 terabyte volumes based on the operating system support that you have. You can even create a 16 terabyte volume if your operating system can support it. And by having a combination of drives, when you get to 4 or 5 drives, you should probably start to see the benefit compared to just 2 or 3, right, Tony?
Exactly.
As we look at leveraging SAN architecture, people have some concerns, Tony. I think you've done a lot of testing and documentation of solutions to help ease some of these concerns. People naturally care about cost. They care about a lot of eggs in one basket from a reliability perspective, and they think SAN's complex because, well, vendors might tell them by consolidating your storage and pooling it, you'll be able to better manage it. It'll be easier for you. Some smaller companies who haven't had experience with SAN think the opposite. They think it's complicated. So maybe you could talk about how you've done your testing and how you've addressed those concerns from a SAN perspective.
Absolutely. And well, I want to say that when I started my odyssey in storage, it was as a field systems engineer for EMC back in 1998. And yeah, at that point, yeah, SANs were really complex.
You had your config floppy drive to go and make your configs, right?
Yeah, lots and lots of gigantic spreadsheets. So essentially, what the SAN architecture brings you, it's come a long way since then, and I mean a tremendously long way since then. And it really does address all of the concerns that are laid out here, right? It does. Using a SAN with data protection integrated on the back end provides you with the reliability that you have to put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. The redundancy built in really goes ties in tightly with the ease of use, right? So if you've got a system where you've got to lay out all the disks, you've got to carve up all the RAID groups, you've got to create all the volumes, you've got to zone everything in your fiber channel network. Yeah, then your concerns are justified. That's a complex thing to do. But being able to really just essentially create, plug a bunch of disks in, create volumes, and let the back-end storage do all of that, right? That's what is available to businesses, small businesses today. Right. And that's what large enterprises are paying millions of dollars for.
Mm-hmm. And they have the expertise in the large enterprise to invest in the people to do that management. From an iSCSI perspective, you mentioned fiber channel being more the enterprise stuff. From an iSCSI perspective, have you found that ease of use has come a long way in terms of the user experience out of box, getting it deployed and getting it up and running?
Yeah, we have. And even I think as important as, or more important than that is what we found is for most production applications out there, iSCSI has more than enough performance to satisfy what businesses need.
Especially if you're a small business and you have a database with 100 users, it's not the same as 10,000 users. So like we say here from addressing the concerns perspective, sizing your components for your application can help you bring in the right solution at the right cost. I wanted to make sure we covered test and dev though, because people who are using direct attached storage may not be doing it. Once you have a SAN, you have no excuse but to really test your stuff with a virtual machine and an extra LUN presented from your storage.
Absolutely. I mean, who wouldn't want to absolutely know for sure that something's going to work before they try it on their production servers?
So we're almost wrapping up here. I'm going to give you an example here where putting together a SAN may not be quite as expensive as you might imagine. We can talk about a small server pool here. I'm showing 4 in the diagram, but you can have dozens if you're running virtualization on top of those. Tony mentioned before that once you have a iSCSI SAN, you have the freedom to move applications across servers with a live migration component with any of the hypervisor vendors that are out there. The solution that we're talking about here is both VMware ready and Citrix ready certified using a pair of storage arrays. Now on the right hand side is a fantastic solution, about a little bit over $15,000, and it's an entry level array that has dual controllers and gives you 16 terabytes of SAN storage. The one idea going with a single consolidated array with dual controllers because you want to have that availability so that you have no single point of failure there. On the left-hand side, as an alternate approach, at about a 25% savings, you can get a pair of storage arrays that are single controller systems outfitted with the same amount of storage. And it gives you the same pooling capability and some redundancy to move data between the two and have those as independent entities. Overall, these are solutions that are a lot less expensive than they used to be, right, Tony?
Oh, absolutely.
It used to be that you'd have to probably have a six-figure number by the time you put the network and the storage together to do a SAN solution. In your experience, does SAN work pretty well these days with VMware and Citrix? Because in the original days, I think there was a lot of blogs that said that the support really wasn't there to take advantage of that. With vSphere 4.0 and 4.1 especially, you probably found that it's working great, even in your own environment.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a tremendous progress has been made both by the virtualization vendors and by the storage vendors.
How much of a difference, Tony, do enterprise drives make? Just about every vendor will give you the choice between 5400 RPM, 7200 RPM drives. There's green drives so you can save electricity. How should people be thinking about that? Because already the choices are complicated. How can you simplify that?
Well, the choices are complicated, and we've done a little bit of testing of different types of drives in different types of arrays for specifically looking at reliability. And the larger your pool of drives, the more important that becomes. Because really what it boils down to is you take an enterprise drive with a 1,000,000-hour MTBF and a 5-year warranty. That's great, but you don't really see the benefit of that over, say, a green drive with a 3-year warranty and a 600,000-hour MTBF until you've got 1,000 of them in your data center. And then you might see 1 or 2 more failures over the course of a year based on the other one, whereas you'll definitely save a little bit of money from power consumption using green drives. So I think in the small medium business perspective, it really doesn't have that huge an impact.
Okay, how about for backup? Is there a benefit to using the enterprise drives if you're just using it as a disk-based backup for a disk-to-disk tape solution?
So if you're going to be using it for long-term storage is what you're talking about.
Right. So the idea is that if it's for long-term, you want to save every penny that you can. Can you get a benefit out of that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I would say I think that you really can economize, right? And you can economize without a huge impact, especially when you're using an infrastructure that is providing availability functions over and above what's built into the individual drives.
From a test development perspective, if I have a shared storage device, do I need to buy an exact copy of that shared storage device that I'm using to use it in test and dev? An example might be I might have a higher scale storage device that I'm using for production, and I don't want to mess with it for my test and dev. Can I test my applications on maybe a less expensive, lower performing device and still get the same benefit, or do I need to really match up my test dev environment to look exactly like my production environment? It's a question we get all the time because people are concerned about costs.
Yeah, and like so many other things in IT, the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're testing functionality, then the answer is probably no. You can probably get away with some economies by going with something a little bit less of a scale than your production environment. But if you're testing for performance, then you're going to need exactly the same number of drives that you have in your production environment to test for that. Most people don't do that, though. Most people are able to get by. What we use is a much smaller pool of disks. Actually, some disks in the same controllers that we use for our production environment just set aside, and this is our test data pool.
Right, and that's actually the answer I was hoping to get, because a lot of people think that they have to keep test and dev completely separate. But from a SAN perspective, you can isolate those volumes. You can isolate that and provide the separation. All right, folks, I'm going to give you a couple key takeaways here, and we'll take some questions off the internet. Shared storage provides some features and benefits that from an IT application perspective are compelling. Tony went through several of those benefits, and for folks who are not yet doing a storage area network or a SAN, there is a benefit to looking into that technology to take advantage of those features and capabilities. iSCSI is a great solution, as Tony mentioned, for doing SAN today. It's not only easy to use, but they're available at relatively affordable costs. And for SMBs, it's best to start with something redundant, reliable that fits into your budget today. I can't tell you how many customers I talk to, Tony, who are doing nothing and they're waiting around to do kind of the ideal solution. And in IT, that almost means you're never going to do it. Just getting something that you can afford and that fits your requirements today is good. You just want to make sure that it has longevity, and Tony mentioned the ability to continue to expand volumes over time, having thin provisioning so that you're able to deploy it and then buy storage as you need it and take advantage of those capabilities. It's an important thing. If I'm only using data storage for my SAN and it's an iSCSI SAN Is it worth the cost to jump from, say, the Drobo FS Pro, which lacks this feature? I guess I'll go ahead and take that. There is network attached storage or file sharing, which is the ability to share storage between multiple servers. And for a lot of your user data, you might use network attached storage. IT applications, in many cases, be it your email or your databases, either require or run better on block level storage. And I'd answer that question by saying it depends on your application. If you're trying to use your IT applications, most likely you'd want to go with a block level device like a Drobo Elite or the other solution that we mentioned there in our putting it together slide. But if you're just doing file sharing, yes, network attached storage works great. The Drobo Pro FS is such a device that provides that. How do you normally give consulting there, Tony, picking NAS versus SAN? Because it's a great question for SMBs. A lot of them don't know the difference.
Sure, and most often the advice I give is to go back to your application vendors and look at what they recommend, right? And so looking at it from, say, the Microsoft Exchange perspective, they don't recommend doing it on file shares. They recommend doing it on either direct attached storage or SAN storage.
For anybody else who has any questions, you can send those in to us at tv@drobo.com. That's TV as in television at drobo.com. You can also go to our drobo.tv website and get access to a replay of this recording, as well as interact with us and get some more information on this topic. We have one more question here about NFS for virtualization versus iSCSI. We talked mostly about iSCSI here. From a virtualization perspective, I know that all the vendors, Citrix, VMware, they support it. How do people go about doing it? Is it the same advice? Go back to your application and see what they recommend?
Well, that does kind of muddy the waters just a little bit, because what people have done is actually used virtualization, used, for instance, an NFS server to provide storage to VMware, which VMware then presents to the virtual machines as if it's a direct attached disk. So it does definitely blur the lines between that. So is one better than the other? Well, that depends on what you mean by better, right? I mean, if the back-end device, if the storage system that's providing that storage is reliable, is redundant, and provides the performance that you need, well, then that's the best one for you, right? It's another one of those it depends answers, right?
All right. Well, as a man who makes his living testing devices, I'm sure you'd recommend that everybody, if they're going to do one of these solutions, try to get a 30-day free evaluation from their vendor so they can bring it on site, test it out. If it runs as a file share just fine, great. If not, then you could look at maybe doing a block level storage. Right. So it's just going out and testing it is always a little bit good. Rule of thumb, though, is file sharing or NAS going to be a little bit slower than block level based on the overhead of the file sharing?
Everything else being equal, yeah, that's going to be the case.
All right, with that brings us to a close on today's broadcast. I want to thank everybody for joining, and thank you, Tony, for not just being our guest expert today, but actually coming into the studio to deliver this live. So for those who want to get more information about the Services Enterprise Strategy Group, you've got the URL there. I'm sure they could get your email there as well and hit you up. But you have a Twitter feed or anything else you want to plug?
No, I don't need to plug that now, but thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. And thanks, everybody, for participating. Join us next time where we'll bring you another fantastic topic of conversation for SMB IT. And until next time, happy sharing.